In the mind of these plotting conspirators, something had to be done to bring these banks under heel. And as John D. Rockefeller said, competition is sin. Secondly, corporations were so strong that were beginning to finance their expansions of profits instead of taking out large loans from large banks. First 10 years of the new century, 70% of corporate spending came from profits. In other words, the American industry was becoming independent of the money changers, and that trend had to be stopped. All the participants knew that these were the problems they wanted done away with, one way or the other. Aldrich believed the word bank should not appear in the bill's name. Warburg wanted to call the legislation the National Reserve Bill. The idea was to give the impression that the purpose of this bill was to conceal the character of the new privately held central bank. And because of his incredibly large ego, he insisted the bill be called the Aldrich Bill. 9 days of bankers conspiring to take over Americans' money, the group dispersed. One thing the group did agree on was that the new bank would be similar to the old one, a privately held one, the Bank of the United States, which, as I've said before, was a central bank, and that it would be given the monopoly over U.S. currency and given the power to create money out of nothing, which was, of course, their primary goal. And the creating money thing we've talked about before, but long story short, the Fed Open Market Committee approves the purchase of U.S. bills. Bonds are purchased by the Fed from whoever's offering them for sale on the open market. Number 3, the Fed pays for the bond with electric credits to the seller's bank. These electric credits are based on nothing, thin air. The Fed creates them out of nothing. Step 4, the bank uses these deposits as reserves, based on nothing, by nothing, and they loan out over 10 times the amount that their reserves have to borrowers at an interest. Yep. So, how does this benefit these guys? Well, misdirection, once again, prevented proper debt-free currency. If delegated to the bankers, well, the right to create 90% of an entire nation's money supply. If centralized, overall control of the U.S. nation's money supply goes to the hand of a very few men. At that point, 5, apparently. It established a central bank with a high degree of independence from effective political control. So, for them to fool the public into believing that the Fed was a government agency, the government would have to retain control of the bank. The planners called for a new central bank to be overseen by a board of governors, appointed by the President of the United States, approved by the Senate. But in reality, all the bankers had to do was be sure they got their men appointed to the board of governors. Easy task, since bankers had money, and money buys influence over politicians. The participants of this secretly held meeting, Jekyll Island, went home. Publicity blitz was on. The big New York bankers put together an educational fund of $5 million to finance professors at respected universities to support this bill. Yeah, can you believe that? We need someone to back this up. So let's give somebody some money and send them to school. I know, it's incredible, right? Woodrow Wilson was one of the first to jump on said great big bandwagon. Aldrich Bill was recognized for what it was and quickly recognized as the Bankers' Bill, a bill that would only be known as the Money Trust. As Congress Lindbergh stated during the bill's debate, the Aldrich Plan is the Wall Street Plan. It means another panic, if necessary, to intimidate the people. Aldrich, paid by the government to represent the people, believe it or not, proposes a plan of trust instead. So, this goes on, debate goes on. The bankers didn't have enough congressional votes to have this passed, right? Bankers were not defeated, even though, well, we jump back to Wilson speaking to the Democratic Party headquarters in New York in 1912, leading him like he would lead a puppy or a poodle on the string. Wilson received an indoctrination course from leaders convened there. So Burke was bringing him around like a puppy. Now the stage was set, money changers poised to install all of their privately owned central bank once again. President Jackson, well, the damage President Jackson had done 76 years earlier had been only partly repaired the passing of the National Bank Act during the Civil War. Since the battle raged on for decades, Jacksonians had become the greenbackers, who would become the hardcore backers of William Jenkins Bryan, with Bryan leading the charge, and the opponents of the money changers, ignorant of Barrash's tutelage, now threw themselves behind the Democratic representative Wilson, who had always worked for the bankers. The Americans and Bryan were about to be betrayed. So, Federal Reserve Act of 1913 became revised. After much ado, and I can go into it, but it's, one of my overly thought out articles again. It links to friggin' everywhere. After the passage, let's just go here, of the Federal Reserve Bill, a Congressman, Lindbergh, explained how the Fed created what we have come to call the business of cycle, and how to use it to manipulate business and property ownership, and all to the benefit of the bankers. To cause high prices, all the Federal Reserve Board will be lower the rediscount rate, producing an expansion of credit and rising stock market, and then businessmen are adjusted to these conditions. It can check prosperity in a mid-career kind of thing, right? Raising the rate of interest. So they play with this over and over, and they got it. Now, finally, the money changers, the bankers, that profit by manipulating the amount of money in circulation, as has been done since the beginning of time, had their privately owned central bank installed once again in America. The major newspapers, which they also owned, hailed the passage of this Federal Reserve Act as a money system that would scientifically, because they had already bought the teachers up, be scientifically prevented. The real fact is that depressions and recessions could now be scientifically created. Hence, World War I, the power to wage war and profit from it. Bankers fund both sides, as they always have, and reap huge profits again as a result. Power is now centralized to a large extent on a global scale, and now it was time for war. Large, costly, destructive one. World War I, the war to end all wars, Part 1. Central bankers. Political issues of the war didn't matter as nearly much as the profit. That's potential that would arise because of this, because nothing creates debt as much as warfare, as we've seen in the past. England was the perfect debt-generating model at the time. One of the best things England could do, as a matter of fact, and still does. During a 119 years between the founding of the Bank of England and Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, England had been at war for 56 years, solid. And much of the remaining time the country had been preparing for war. During World War I, the German Rothschilds loaned money to the Germans. The British Rothschilds loaned money to the British. The French Rothschilds loaned money to the French. In the U.S., J.P. Morgan was a sales agent for war material to both the British and the French. In fact, 6 months into the war, Morgan became the largest consumer on the planet, spending $10 million a day. His offices at Wall Street were mobbed by brokers and salesmen trying to cut a deal. Many other New York bankers made a fortune on the war as well. President Wilson appointed Bernard Baruch to the head of the war's industry board. According to historians, both Baruch and the Rockefellers profited by $200 million during the war. Their profits were not the only motive here, though. There was also revenge. The money changers never forgot the Tsar for his support of Lincoln during the Civil War. Also, Russia was the last major European nation to refuse to give the privately owned central bank scheme a go. 3 years after World War I, the bank money toppled the Russian Tsar and installed communism. So, Jacob Schiff, Loeb and Company bragged on his deathbed that he had spent $20 million towards the defeat of just the Tsar. Money was then funneled into England to support the revolution. The question begs, why would some of the world's richest men financially back communism, a system openly vowing to destroy the so-called capitalism that had made them all wealthy? Well, if you understand that socialism is not share the wealth program here, it is a method to consolidate and control wealth, then the seemingly paradox of these super rich men promoting socialism becomes no paradox at all. It makes sense. It's logical. Even a perfect tool of power-seeking megalomaniacs. Communism, or more accurately, socialism, is not a movement for the downtrodden masses here, but it's of the economic elite only. Power from any source tends to create appetite for additional power. It is also inevitable that the super rich would one day aspire to control not only their own wealth, but the wealth of the entire world. And this they have done, and were perfectly willing to feed the ambitions of power-hungry political conspirators, of course, who were committed to the overthrow of whatever existing government and establishment of whatever the central worldwide dictatorship was at the time. Now, to keep all of these dictators in check, the bank would contract the money supply or finance their oppositions if they got out of control. Lenin understood that, and although he was an absolute dictator of the new Soviet Union, he was not the one pulling the financial strings. Lenin stated the state does not function as we desired. The cart